Well, good afternoon, everyone. I have that it's 12:05, and it appears that we have loaded the majority of participants into the room. We may still have some folks join us, but so pleased that you could be with us this afternoon. My name is Amy Johnson, here from UNC-Chapel Hill Student Affairs, and as noted, we appreciate you being with us today. We started an intentional campus-wide conversation in 2021 to help our faculty, staff, and students respond to the global mental health crisis that we've all been facing, including its specific effects on our Carolina community, with a desire to educate and support our students, faculty, and staff, as well as to reduce stigma, to build resilience, and to encourage help-seeking behavior. Following our first mental health summit in fall of 2021, we launched our Heals Care Network initiative to actively support and foster Carolina's culture of compassion and care. And since then, we've engaged in a regular cadence of these mental health seminars as a way to extend our dialogue. And we're so pleased that you have joined us for our very first seminar of the 2023-24 academic year. We are mindful that the timing of this seminar is particularly important because many of us are needing to engage and connect with our colleagues to process and heal from a traumatic event that we've all experienced recently, the loss of a beloved colleague, teacher, and mentor with the tragic shooting of Dr. Ziji Yen late last month. We had originally planned for this session to be a discussion of mental health and nutrition, which was a topic that we've heard from members of our community that they'd like to learn more about. And we promise that that topic is still coming for those of you who are interested. It will just happen a little bit later in the year. But today, we thought it was important to revamp our plans and take the time to acknowledge that the shooting and the extended lockdown period had an effect on our entire community, for many, a profound one. We hope that this session will offer valuable perspectives regarding how to navigate trauma and grief, and we'll share some ideas regarding how we can foster our individual and collective coping strategies as we continue to recover from this experience. We're glad to have you with us today and welcome you to join in, to listen, to learn, to reflect, and to share as you feel comfortable. I have just a few keynotes today to help you navigate this seminar. First of all, the chat is enabled for participants to communicate both with one another and with the production team behind the scenes. For questions for our facilitator, please use the Q&A feature if you would. That will help us track behind the scenes what questions we have answered and those that we haven't. And please know that anonymous questions are welcome. Participants can see all the questions, including those that are unanswered, and you can upvote any questions you like. Dr. Rosenstein is prepared to answer questions primarily at the end of the presentation, but he has also indicated that if you have a burning question midway, please feel free to shoot that into the Q&A or raise a hand, and we can address that then. If you are a student who is joining us for a CLE credit, please know that we will pop up that QR code slide at the very end of the program, so that's coming. And with that, I think we've covered all of the housekeeping issues. So allow me to introduce our facilitator. We are thrilled to have with us today a terrific UNC expert to guide our conversation, and are particularly appreciative that he was willing to join us on short notice. I'm both pleased and extremely grateful to introduce Dr. Donald Rosenstein, who serves as the Director of the Comprehensive Cancer Support Program, Division Head of General Adult Psychiatry, and a Professor of Psychiatry and Medicine at UNC-Chapel Hill. Dr. Rosenstein earned his undergraduate degree in psychology from Wesleyan University and his medical degree from Northwestern University School of Medicine. He completed his residency training in psychiatry at Yale University. Dr. Rosenstein came to UNC from the National Institutes of Health, where he was clinical director of the NIH National Institute, of Mental Health, NIM, and the chief of Psychiatry Consultation Liaison Service. Donald, given your experience and expertise, we know that we are in good hands for today's discussion. Thank you again for your willingness to serve as our facilitator, and the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Johnson. Give me just a moment to pull up my slides. Bear with me, everyone. Can I get a thumbs up or some indication that you can see my slides? Beautiful. Okay. I am very grateful and humbled to be here today, and I'm particularly impressed with the Chancellor's office for this series and for making this particular conversation and so many others that have been taking place around campus a high priority during such a difficult time for the university. I'm really glad everyone is here. It looks like I've lost count, but when I looked before, it looks like over 140 or so participants. I don't know who you are. I hope to find out who some of you are towards the end. This session is intended to help us process what are really horrific circumstances over the last couple of weeks. The murder of Zhizhayan has been kind of unthinkable for so many of us. And each of us is here right now with our own thoughts, our own feelings, our own worries, memories, frustrations, ideas about what needs to happen that are related to this awful event. And we're here at the same time together, at least we are electronically. So before sharing my comments, I'd like us to begin with a moment of silence and reflection together, thinking about Professor Yan and his family. We'll take just a few moments here in silence. Thank you. When you're in person, it's more palpable when everyone takes a moment together, but I appreciate allowing that time. For me, a moment of silence like this is a powerful reminder that we can be in our own heads and in our own hearts at the same time that we're together as a community. And as you've already heard from Professor Johnson, I think that's the main goal here. And I think that the university is doing a spectacular job in that regard. Nothing about this is easy. Places of learning are meant to be safe places. They have to be safe places. And certainly after the tragic killing of one of our own professors, just a few days into the start of a new academic year, it shakes kind of to the foundation that sense of safety. And we need to find a way forward. And I'm not entirely sure what that way forward is, but we're going to try to do that together. And I certainly appreciate an opportunity to try to contribute in some way if I can. But to be honest with you all, I have quite modest expectations that what I have to share with you today will make that much of a difference. The bottom line is that this has been a truly awful event that cannot be fixed, certainly not with words alone, and certainly not quickly. But I'd like to try to at least share some perspectives that I hope might be of some help or comfort to some of you. So bear with me, because I also think that in all likelihood, what is going to resonate most importantly, most deeply with you all is what you have to share with each other. So we have intentionally left plenty of time. I've kept my comments as brief as I can. We've left a lot of time at the end of my presentation so that we can benefit from our collective wisdom. So this is what my game plan is for the next few minutes. I am going to do something that I haven't done really before in talks, which is to tell you something about myself. And this is something that I've seen more and more frequently over the last few years. And I like it when people give talks, they kind of share something about their background, because I think it's important for you all to know what my perspective is, what the context is that kind of I am coming to you from. So I will do that in the service of at least making the first of three main messages that I want to leave you all with today. Then I'm going to have a very brief moment talking about the consequences of trauma as we understand them. And then finish up with talking about some of the things that we've learned are helpful in the aftermath of trauma. And in particular, some of the things that I've learned in work that I've done clinically to have a better sense of how we grieve. And I think that what we've been taught about grief isn't really how it goes, but we'll get back to that. And then, as I mentioned at the end, we'll have a chance to have a conversation. So, first, who I'm not. I am not an expert on school shootings. I am not a post-traumatic stress disorder researcher, and I'm certainly not a policy wonk about gun laws. I am also not someone who has a lot of confidence that the problem of gun violence in America is going to be fixed anytime soon. I would love nothing more than to be wrong about that. But I suspect that, like a lot of you, I have been somewhat demoralized over the last couple of decades that we are in this place where it's so easy to get guns, and when so many murders and suicides are caused by the availability or worsened by the availability of guns. And so I think I'm staying hopeful. Other countries have done better at this than we have. I'm not giving up, but I'm not holding my breath if this is going to change in the next days or weeks or months, maybe even years. But we all have to keep trying. But this is not why I was asked to talk with you today. So let me kind of shift to kind of not from who I'm not, but who I am. I am what's called a consultation liaison psychiatrist. And all that means is that I do psychiatry at the interface of psychiatry and medicine. So I care for individuals who have cancer or HIV/AIDS or renal failure or lung problems, any kind of medical problem whatsoever. And I do that work predominantly on the inpatient side and also in the outpatient clinic, mostly at the cancer hospital. I've been at UNC now for almost 15 years. I came here after my time, as you heard, at the NIH. And I came here in large part because of my interest in being in a university setting, to do more teaching, to have more students. I, again, don't know what the makeup is of those of you who are on this webinar, but I hope there are a lot of students. I've already gotten emails from several. And the idea that you're off at college and this is kind of the first wave that hits you is really terribly unfortunate. And so I'm glad we're talking about it. My academic appointments here are in the Department of Psychiatry and also the Department of Medicine and the Division of Oncology. And I think that I was asked to do this because I have a research interest in bereavement and adaptation to various kinds of loss. And the work that I've done has involved widowed parents, which was partly why Professor Yen's tragic death kind of struck me so deeply, because over the last dozen or so years with a colleague named Justin Yap, I've had the privilege of working with well over 100 widowed mothers and fathers, predominantly widowed fathers, mostly from the cancer experience. And so I know intellectually and also kind of firsthand from sitting with all of these kind of brave folks, what faces someone after the loss of a parent, after, and in my clinical work, after multiple losses. And I'll return to that concept a little bit later. Who I am personally: I am a husband. I am a father of two wonderful kids. This is a picture on the left of my wife and two kids. The tall, redheaded boy, young man, is Kobe. He's now 31. He has profound autism and epilepsy. My daughter, Emma, is almost 30 at this point. And I show you this picture because of kind of, again, some of my perspective about, where I've come from and kind of what my hopes and dreams and aspirations were, like many of you, to have a safe and comfortable and healthy life with a family. This picture on the right is my mother and father. They are alive and at this point quite frail. This is kind of the last picture of both of them not in wheelchairs from about a month or so ago. And the reason I show you this picture is that my father's kind of son of immigrants, like many people on campus, and had a very intense, dedicated commitment to raising his family with as many opportunities in education as possible. And this is a picture taken in kind of the town that they've lived in their entire lives, which is a suburb of Chicago. And this is where I come from. I'm from the Midwest, from an upper middle class Jewish family. And this is a picture of the house that I grew up in, kind of a 2-bedroom place in a town called Highland Park. And this is just one picture from growing up. And as you can see, it is not the most diverse classroom that you've ever seen. I have essentially gone from one place to another my entire life that was safe and a place of privilege. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because a big part of what I want to share has to do with prior context, prior experience, prior exposure to violence and trauma, and that determines to a large extent kind of the response to a new trauma, an inevitable new trauma. This is a picture of my mother's graduation when she got her master's degree in social work at the University of Chicago. This is back in 1969 on a very hot day. And I show you this picture because, as I mentioned, kind of grew up in Highland Park, and here's a map of the Chicago area. And, you know, Highland Park is about 25 miles north of downtown Chicago. The University of Chicago, for those of you who don't know, is on the south side, and is a beautiful campus that is surrounded by a rough and tumble neighborhood. And I'm pointing this out because a little over a week ago with my clinical group, we had spent an hour talking about our reactions to the shooting. And we were all reminded by a chaplain who works at the cancer hospital, Lisa Williams, that for some of us, these kinds of traumatic events are shocking and brand new. But for others, they're all too familiar. And she reminded us that in many, many respects, the beginnings of this country were beginnings with intense violence that have been kind of endured by different populations perpetually. And in fact, partly what's going on is that as acts of violence, random and otherwise, kind of seem to be increasing dramatically, I think more groups that may not have been exposed to this kind of violence are seeing it. And so again, by way of juxtaposition, this town that I grew up in, which was very safe, very devoid of kind of trauma and violence, was kind of shattered a year ago on the 4th of July with a shooting during the 4th of July parade in Highland Park. And this was just the latest in kind of a daily series of shootings around the country. And for me, I have one kind of reaction to this because of where I came from. Now, my daughter grew up in Washington, D.C. She was in, I think, 5th or 6th grade on 9/11, which was quickly followed by sniper shootings and an anthrax scare. She, like so many of you students, have grown up with shelter-in-place protocols, with active shooter protocols, and with a series of reminders about the ways in which the world is not safe. And it should be safe, and we need to make it safer, but it's not. And so the question then becomes, what do we do about that, and how do we respond to it? Which leads me to my kind of first message, which I hope I've just made by kind of sharing something about my history of privilege and my kind of relative being spared of some of the things that some of my colleagues have not been spared growing up. We really don't know unless we start talking to it. We can't begin to know kind of what other people's prior experiences of trauma and violence are. One of the other members of our group shared, as we were talking about this last week, that this was nothing new to her. She grew up in the projects of Los Angeles, and she said people were shot and shot at every single day. So just not to make too sharp a point of this right now, but I think that the first step here is that someone's prior experience, their antecedent context, is critically important to how they make sense out of this. There are other people who I think somewhat bravely shared that they kind of were not surprised by this, that they've kind of come to a place where they feel like it's a matter of time before the next thing happens. And so I think it's really important not to make assumptions about what other people are going through, not to make the assumption that everyone is having the same experience to what's happened that we have had. Okay, the second message that I will get back to in a little bit is this notion about how you respond to terrible things, how you respond to trauma and loss. And in addition to it being individually determined, it's a lot less linear, kind of the grief and bereavement and the adjustment reaction. It's much more dynamic than I think most of us have been taught to believe. And another kind of odd notion here is that sometimes trauma can be as much about the future as the past, which may sound a little bit odd, but this is what I mean by it. It is understandable that when something awful happens, that all of the attention gets focused on that awful thing, returning to that awful thing, thinking about it, having images, memories, upset, and so on. But very often the healing process really has more to do with now what? Now that this thing has happened, what do I do with this? How do I feel about this? What decisions do I want to make? Do I want to stay in the same place that I am? Do I feel safe here? Do I want to stay with the same people? Do I want to keep doing the same things that I've done before? These are all questions that often don't have obvious answers right at the beginning and can add to the anxiety about how to respond to this. So we'll loop back to that, but hold on to that notion. So from a graphical point of view, this is kind of old conceptual work that kind of lays this out, that there is an event that happens or a series of events. And if you've got the level of functioning on kind of the y-axis and time on the x-axis, there are a variety of ways that things can go. And a lot depends on your own resources, who you are with, who you talk to, what kind of help you get, whether you need help, what that looks like. And so we'll talk about counseling and the response over time, because I think this period of what happens after a major event like this, an awful major event, and this could be anything. This could be, as it is right now for us, a school shooting. This could be the death of someone that you love. This could be a kind of personal bankruptcy. This could be an illness that you yourself have. This can be any kind of manner of loss and difficulty. And this is a very dynamic time, what happens afterwards in the hours, days, weeks, months, and years that come afterwards and kind of determining what happens with folks. So my third message is one that I hope comes as no surprise to you, and I hope you've heard this over and over again. And that is, if you are feeling scared, if you're feeling alone, if you're feeling marginalized, if you're feeling alienated, if you are not sleeping, if you can't get certain thoughts and things out of your head, if you are barely hanging on, it's important for you to know that there is both hope and help available here. I have been so impressed at UNC since I've been here, and I just love Caroline and the 15 years I've been here. I think this is really an exceptional community. But I've been so impressed with the leadership and authentic responses to address various aspects of the mental health crisis going on in our country and in our community right now. There are kind, smart, hardworking people that are actually spending lots of time thinking about how can we address what's needed on our campus. And this second line here, that mental health care is accessible at UNC, is not something that anyone should take seriously. We take for granted. We should take it very seriously, because there are places all over the world where that's not true, where it's really hard to have access to competent professionals who can help provide the specific kind of care that people need. So if nothing else, I hope that as you flip this thing off at the end of it and you go on about your day, you keep that notion with you that if you or someone you know is really struggling, they don't need to do that on their own. There are multiple ways to get help. All right, this is a slide where, if I'm being perfectly candid, I completely punted. So I had about 3 or 4 slides that cataloged the overwhelming evidence that the world is a dangerous place. And I just couldn't do it. I didn't want to show it. I had data slides on how disgracefully frequent childhood exploitation is, that more than 20% of American women are raped at some time in their life. The exposure to gun violence, the exposure to interpersonal violence in other ways, the exposure to serious illness and opioid deaths and any manner of traumatic experiences. And then I kind of looked at those slides and I said, nobody needs to see all those numbers. So I decided to put up a pretty picture instead, and just to tell you what you already know, which is that trauma is ubiquitous and too frequent. And it doesn't mean that we need to become inured to it and tolerant of it. I think that our responsibility as community members at every level is to keep working towards making the world safe and to treating children kindly and safely, not exploiting people. But the fact of the matter is that this is true of life, and it will continue to be true of life to a greater or lesser extent. So you didn't need me to kind of just go over and over with all of the various terrible things about life. You know this. You've experienced it in various ways. We've learned a lot about the adverse experiences in childhood and in young adulthood. This isn't just young children. It extends into young adulthood for sure. And these adverse experiences are called, ACEs, adverse childhood events, if you haven't heard that acronym before. And it is a way for researchers to try to get a handle on the frequency and complications of various forms of trauma. And essentially what is at stake is a loss, not just of safety, but the sense of safety and stability and bonding. I think some people can reasonably argue that our campus is no more dangerous today than it was 2 weeks ago from a statistical point of view, but that in many respects misses the point that the sense of safety has been deeply challenged, and that's part of this. So what happens when there are bad things that happen to kids growing up and young adults and even older adults? Well, certainly for developing children and adolescents and young adults, I think there are major consequences of adverse childhood events, including a variety of different mental health consequences and physical consequences. And surprisingly, even mortality, and that there is compelling evidence that having bad things happen when you're young can be associated with a greater risk of death, earlier death, than people who have not had those same bad things. And the world has been tough for the last few years, as you all know very well. I have to also comment that at long last, there's finally starting to be good research and an adequate or emerging attention to the impact of race and ethnicity and social economic status as well. And this is just one example from research that I know about from the work that I do that has to do with what happens if there's an early parental loss. And there's very strong evidence that this particular kind of trauma disproportionately affects children of color. And that's an entirely separate lecture, but we can certainly talk about that in the question and answer in a few minutes. Then what happens? What does it look like after trauma? And it's not surprising. People are on heightened alert. They're irritable, they're agitated, there's more anxiety, there can be you can be short-tempered. People who have been exposed to gun violence and gunshots can develop startle reflexes and kind of jump if there's a loud noise or certain kinds of touches. These are all manifestations of increased physiologic arousal, in addition to some of these experiences of intrusive, upsetting dreams, flashbacks, trouble concentrating, difficulty trusting. I imagine that for so many of you that, at the same time that you're trying to kind of really roll up your sleeves and get into serious studying, this is on your minds, this is on your phones, this is kind of everywhere you look over the last couple of weeks, and will continue to be for a while. And it can make it really easy to feel disconnected and somewhat dissociated from things that are happening. So these are the kinds of symptoms that happen. And in the aftermath of an acute event like this, we talk about what constitutes an acute stress reaction or acute stress disorder, and that's distinguished only by time from what everyone refers to as post-traumatic stress disorder. And so I'm not going to read this out loud. You can see this, it's easy to look up, but these are just a different way to organize some of the symptoms that I was just talking about in post-traumatic stress disorder. After an exposure to a traumatic event, there are intrusive symptoms, things that just take over when you don't want them, or at least expect them. These can be nightmares and flashbacks. You can kind of feel like you check out in various circumstances, terrible memories of events. There can be avoidant symptoms. I've heard from plenty of people that they have changed where they go after a traumatic event. They don't want to go to that place or near that place that was associated with something that was so terrifying. There can be lots of kind of depressive symptoms or negative cognitions, kind of checking out of things that you might like to do otherwise, and also some of this arousal that I talked about earlier. And when this happens for a matter of days or up to a month, you're talking about acute stress reaction or acute stress disorder. When it goes on for more than a month, that's when we talk about clinically significant distress or PTSD. And if it impairs what you're doing, if you can't go to classes, if you can't teach classes, if you're a professor, if you're having trouble going to work, if you're not sleeping, if you're not eating. So this is kind of a theme that will go through any kind of reaction and should be thought about in terms of, well, how do I know if I need to get some help? If you feel like you need help, you should ask for help. You don't have to wait until the symptoms are debilitating. But certainly if they are debilitating, if they are getting in the way of you doing whatever it is that you do, that's the time for ask for help. Worst case scenario is you say, okay, I'm doing better than I thought I was doing. And this is kind of a normal reaction, and you don't need to continue. But my own feeling, having done psychotherapy or provided psychotherapy for many years, and having been a patient in psychotherapy several times in my life, is that it's one of those things that is extraordinarily helpful when you're in the right hands with someone who, again, is kind and smart and kind of paying attention to what's going on. So what is it that helps after something awful like this? Well, I think it depends on several things. Depends on kind of what the problem is that you're trying to fix. All right. Counseling, talk therapy does not solve problems of inadequate safety protocols in communities. It does not get anywhere close to problems of kind of certain gun laws or other kinds of safety concerns. So if instead what you're talking about is trying to help with how you're reacting to something that happened rather than what were the root causes of that thing happening in the first place, that's a separate conversation in a lot of respects. And a lot of it depends on the context of what happened and the timing and kind of a certain readiness. And if you'll allow me a quick little side trip to talk about individual variability in terms of vulnerability and resilience, I think what helps also depends on who needs the help. So this is a fascinating article that anyone who's interested, I would highly recommend. It's a very dense review article that was written a few years ago that picks up on a really, I think, helpful metaphor for understanding individual differential response to bad things happening. And the metaphor essentially talks about orchids and dandelions. What does that have to do with any of this? Well, the people who originally described this kind of summarized data from many, many studies, looking in laboratory studies and others, looking at kind of inherent variability, and especially with children, and that there were some low reactivity children and some high reactivity children in response to various environmental influences. And they found a really interesting interactive effect between the reactivity, whether you're a low or high reactive child, and either low or high social environmental adversity. And this is what that interaction looks like. So you can imagine, for those of you who raise flowers and try to get rid of weeds, perhaps, either or, that if you look at this graph, just to get you oriented, on the left side of this graph where it says low on the x-axis, social environmental adversity, low adversity, these are optimum circumstances, the right light, the right soil, the right amount of water, the kind of, right temperature, all of that. Under circumstances like that, you could imagine this blue line representing high reactivity individuals, that's perfect for beautiful orchids. But that as you move to the right, if you follow that blue line to the right, under high adversity circumstances, maybe it's too dry, maybe it's too bright, maybe it's too warm or too cold or whatever, orchids don't do well under high adversity circumstances. In contrast, dandelions do really well in all sorts of circumstances. And that kind of just serves in my mind as kind of an exaggerated metaphor for the fact that some of us come into the world more resilient or more vulnerable in various ways, either by our biology or because of environmental adversity over time. And I think it's important to be respectful of the fact that one size after trauma does not fit all people. I lost my advance capacity. Okay. So given the individual differences that we all have, what is it that helps respond? What does it help? What helps to process an event like this? How do we adjust? How do we heal? How do we grieve? And the truth of the matter is that time is probably the most important variable here, that we all have lots of internal resources and figure out ways when all sorts of bad things happen over time to make sense of that, to incorporate that, to figure out what it means and what it doesn't mean to our lives, and to move on. And so here I want to take another quick side trip to talk about kind of grief, because this is kind of a cool model that I didn't even know about until I started working with these widowed parents. So back in 1969, also at the University of Chicago, as a matter of fact, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was a psychiatrist, was doing studies of people who were diagnosed with cancer and were anticipating their own death. And she famously described the 5 stages of grief as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, which immediately took hold. It seemed to make some sense. People could identify with it. People can remember 5 things. And what she did that was invaluable is she started a national conversation about death and dying in this country with this very short book that is an interesting historical book. I think she did a great service. It turns out, though, that there aren't a lot of data to support the 5 stages of grief. And certainly there's not a lot of data to suggest that when people respond to something terrible, either a death of someone else, anticipating their own death, some kind of traumatic event, they certainly don't uniformly progress through each stage into the next in a linear fashion. It's more complicated than that, and it's better than that, actually. And this is a better model for thinking about it that I think makes a lot of sense. And this was something that was proposed in the late 90s by 2 Danish psychologists. It's called the dual process model of bereavement. And it is more dynamic and I think more real life and true. And the basic idea behind the dual process model is that whenever something happens that results in loss or a response requiring some kind of adaptation, we have 2 sets of tasks facing us. One of them is a backward-looking task, and one of them is a forward-looking task. So the backward-looking task they described as loss-oriented stressors. These are the things that we typically think about in grief and bereavement and adaptation to loss. You have memories. You have a memory of a person that you lost. You have a memory of a feeling that when you walk into a classroom, you don't have to worry about whether someone's walking around with a gun. A favorite class, a favorite professor, a favorite afternoon on campus, whatever it is. It could be even a prior sense of feeling safe and secure. Those are things that feel like you had that, you lost that, you're looking backwards, and that's what you're trying to process. This is the more traditional grief work that people talk about. And that's contrasted with what they call restoration-oriented stressors. The fact of the matter is classes will resume. You've got midterms coming up. There are new relationships. There are ways in which that we all have to move on after something bad happens. And what this model then says is that the normal response to getting past something difficult is more dynamic. And what happens is there are also everyday life experiences. You can't spend all your time thinking about what the terrible thing that happened or kind of what you have to do going forward. Sometimes you want to take in a baseball game or a movie or just have some fun in everyday life. But in terms of the work of bereavement and adjustment, what they described is this notion of oscillation that goes back and forth, that you can be completely preoccupied with the thing that you lost one moment, and then the next moment kind of, oh yeah, I've got to get my car tuned up next week. You know, life goes on in various ways, and that there is nothing pathological about oscillating between these challenges. And in fact, what happens is that over time, it attenuates, but it doesn't stop. It's not like you pass through the bargaining phase and you're done with that phase. You can be 1 year out, 2 years out, 10 years out, and you can pick up a newspaper article, this might be sometime in the future, about a shooting on a college campus, and it may flip you right back into that visceral state that you might be in right now. It doesn't go away entirely. It attenuates unless you get too stuck in one or the other and you can't kind of have that thing tamping down over time. But for the most part, the data are very convincing that the vast majority of people can deal with unthinkable kinds of stressors in a healthy way and move on productively and without kind of major consequences going forward with good processing. Okay, I'm wrapping up here, y'all. I suspect that the thing that will help more than anything else in terms of feeling safe again is lots of time where nothing like this happens again, where the thought about it, the worry about it, the kind of talk about it even quiets down, and we get back to the business of being a student, the business of being a teacher, the business of working on a campus that should be and is fundamentally a safe place to be. None of that is to say that there isn't work to be done to make our community and to make our world safer and more secure. And even yesterday, I think I saw this in the New York Times. There's some really interesting developments at Yale undergraduate campus with respect to policies and changes in kind of how to deal with mental health issues in students, and dramatic changes in how Yale University deals with mental illness as a direct result of student activism. This is, again, one of those areas that I think we are very fortunate to be at Carolina. The leadership of this university is taking this seriously, not just this recent violent event, but kind of essentially all of the ways in which our sense of safety, security, and the ability to learn in the kind of university that we want has been challenged in recent years. And so I've heard some grumblings about the number of emails and the number of offerings and so on. What a nice problem to have that the university is responding in this way. So much better than kind of lack of interest or silence. I'm going to wrap up in just a minute so that we can start our conversation amongst ourselves, because there's no question that feeling like you're not in this alone is a big part of doing this. Understanding each other and strengthening our sense of community, I think, is really critical going forward. I'm happy to answer questions that anyone may have about, again, how do you know when you need counseling? How do you know if you need medications? I never miss an opportunity to share my daughter's famous line when she was very young, probably around the same time I talked about her earlier, when she was maybe in 5th or 6th grade. One of her friends asked her what her mother and father did for a living, and she very proudly proclaimed that her father was a psychiatrist. And it's true that I prescribe a lot of medications for my patients. It's not always indicated. Sometimes it is, and I'm happy to kind of answer some questions about the practice of psychiatry. And then the last thing that I'll leave you with is that it can't be about psychological work all the time. That's just exhausting. What we need to do is we need to get back to studying and to teaching and to working and to playing and Carolina basketball, if that's what you're into, or eating, or whatever it is that makes you feel engaged, alive, and like life is good again. Because for a while, it can feel like everywhere you turn is a scary place. Again, I don't know what those words will or won't do. I appreciate the chance to share some of my thinking about this. And as I said before, I'm looking forward to hearing what you all have to say and learning from you as well. So, Professor Johnson, thank you. I can stop my slides and we can look at each other maybe.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenstein. That was really helpful. In particular, I took lots of notes about the dual process of bereavement and wanting to look that up and learn more about that. For everyone in the room, please know that the Q&A function is open and available. You may submit your question anonymously, as I mentioned at the top, and we'll start with those. But maybe just while we're loading those questions up and giving everyone an opportunity to put those in the Q&A box, Dr. Rosenstein, one of the things that I mentioned again at the outset was that we've spent a lot of time, particularly over the last couple of years, focusing in on this Carolina culture of compassion and care and the Heals Care Network as a real asset that the university offers. And I think you touched on that in a variety of ways too. Can you talk a little bit more about the role that the community can play in the healing process following a collective trauma, and how can individuals support and help one another perhaps in this process?
Yeah, I think that it's a wonderful question. And I want to make a distinction that I didn't make before, because it's a fuzzy line, and the fuzzy line is between what is a normal reaction to a terribly abnormal event and what is a abnormal or pathological reaction, and that's not always easy to draw a sharp line of demarcation. I think that we need to normalize that whatever you're feeling after something like this is legitimate. I mean, this is a very, very big deal, however you look at it. And I don't think that it's helpful to talk about what's normal and abnormal as a community in that regard. And I think that we need to have a lot of grace and patience and compassion with a range of different reactions, including people seemingly not reacting at all. It's like, how could you be so jaded to kind of violence in society and so on? So that's one point I want to make. The world is different than the world I grew up in good and bad ways. One of the ways that I love how it's different, I don't know if anyone else out there is a tennis fan, but the US Open tennis tournament has been going on, and they've been phenomenal matches. And in the interviews, I've been struck by how many elite athletes are open about their struggles with depression and anxiety. It is a different world to own your experience in that regard. And I think it's fabulous, because it decreases stigma and it lowers the threshold for people asking for and receiving help. So there's a lot that we can do as a community to make this a place where it's okay to share whatever it is that you're sharing. And if it's really over the top, if it's really getting in the way, you get professional help. But it's not all or nothing. You can do both. You can kind of share with your friends and with your professors and anyone else kind of what your struggles are, and bring it to your therapist in between.
Appreciate that a lot. A question in the chat indicates, after this tragic event, certain groups of individuals on campus who have characteristics, e.g. race or ethnicity, that are associated with the killer student have experienced a strong sense of insecurity, viewing biased media reports in the nation and hate languages in social media, targeting, I believe that's supposed to say, Chinese Americans and international students and students from Wuhan, China. Where can these individuals find help on campus to regain a sense of security? Have any initiatives been proposed to reduce this type of unreasonable hate on campus, if any, and foster a sense of security for this group of individuals?
Yeah, I might defer to you on this one, because I don't know the answer to the question. It's a fair question. It's a hard question. I know that in terms of feeling marginalized and even targeted in various ways, there are a lot of people who did not grow up in this country that don't feel particularly welcome here in different settings and for a lot of reasons. And that's terribly unfortunate. We have to fix it. I don't know what the formal kind of, university responses are to kind of address some of that, but that fundamentally gets to what kind of community do we have and do we want to have in terms of tolerance and acceptance. But it's there, we have a lot of people who are here from other countries. English is not their first language. Money may be very tight. I was reminded of this by my colleague Stephanie Wheeler. A lot of people send money back home, and it's a different kind of struggle to be in another country, not feeling as connected as people around you seem to be. But Professor Johnson, I don't know if you have other thoughts from the university side.
No, I appreciate you tackling that very much. So I would say a couple of things just in the context of this particular conversation that also might relate to other groups or other individuals who also may feel a sort of a sense of stigma or biased communication toward them. So a couple of resources. One is I'd always encourage folks to go to the Heals Care Network to identify particular interests, whether or not that's a particular identity that you hold or particular resource that you're interested in. That can be a great starting point. But a couple of other things. One, we have our UNC Asian American Center here on campus, which can be a tremendous resource, not only to build a sense of community, but also to access and get referred to other resources on campus. And we have, as of, I think, approximately 2 years ago now, folks may remember we created our multicultural health resource in CAPS. So that team of folks are particularly well trained and educated in terms of how to respond, to individuals of color, and to be able to address the particular kind of trauma or experiences that community may have. And we do have folks in that team in CAPS who may be a good resource for folks if they are interested in pursuing clinical counseling as well. So I would encourage, just to get started, those sort of key resources. And certainly if there are other things and specific interests that folks may have, you can always reach out to us in Student Affairs, and we can help refer and encourage you or point you toward other opportunities as well. So appreciate that. Another question here. I always love this question. For someone looking to go into clinical therapy as a career, do you have any advice for protecting your own heart and mental health from the trauma that you will inevitably hear from clients? And as to your point, we very likely have a number of students who are with us. I always think this question about how do I prepare myself for potentially this career path and how to be successful in it is a really helpful question to our students.
It's a wonderful question. And I guess I'm getting closer to the tail end of my career, and the cumulative pain that I have sat with over the decades is substantial, and it's a real risk. I think it is an occupational hazard, is of our business. And what I would say is that this is about volume control and balance as much as anything else. I just remember feeling when I was a medical intern that the difference between loving internal medicine and absolutely hating it was whether I had 10 patients that I was managing or 20 patients that I was managing. And similarly, I've had a private practice in the past, and it can be too much, and you have to pay attention to what too much for you is. So that's one thing, is just kind of it's easy to get burnt out if day in and day out all you're doing is kind of helping people with their struggles. I think you need to stay healthy. I think it's really important to take time off. It's really important to eat well and exercise. It's important to take vacations and read and have something that makes you feel gives you a sense of identity other than your professional identity. It happens a lot in the healing professions, that we kind of become what we do. And it is a job at the end of the day, and you have to kind of remember that. What I would also say is that in this business in particular, I think one of the things that mental health professionals do brilliantly, and I think other fields should do more of, is this notion of supervision. Having a more senior person who you talk with regularly, formally or informally on occasion, about the tough cases, about your reactions to those tough cases, and kind of how to deal with those things. And then the last thing that I would say before moving on to another question is that I think everyone has to find their own recipe. And for me, it's always been a balance between clinical work and other stuff, between clinical work and research, between clinical work and teaching, and between clinical work and administration. And if I were only doing clinical work, I don't think I'd still be doing it right now. It's hard work. And so for me, having intellectual projects that really jazz me, that keep me engaged and interested and inform what I do clinically, give me kind of a viewpoint on the world, has been really helpful and kind of kept me fresh in this. But the fact of the matter is, there have been times, and there are times, I think, for all of us in this business, or most of us, where it's like, where there's compassion fatigue. It's just too much. It's just, and so I think you need to pay close attention to that, and monitor it, and figure out, by talking with other people, kind of different, tips for how to keep it in check. I don't know if that helps.
I think that was great. And I think there were even some touchstones for folks who are, outside of that particular field. Appreciate it so much.
Good.
A great question here about, is there any research to support the idea that outdoor therapy, i.e. time in gardens, parks, etc., is helpful in the recovery process?
Yes. I don't know that literature nearly as well as I should, but I don't doubt it for a minute. I've certainly read lots of articles over the years about exercise, and its impact on mental illness, about Tai Chi and other kinds of meditative or practices. Certainly, there's a wealth of information about meditation and about deep relaxation and breathing and yoga. And the short answer is yes. And it's not my area of expertise, but there's a huge amount of data that supports kind of the health benefits of all of those things that you mentioned, for sure. So plus, it's nice to be outside. It's nice to hike. It's nice to garden. And I think that when you look around at different cultures around the world, you'll see that kind of putting your phone down and getting your hands in dirt or clay, or doing pottery. I like to do woodworking, kind of, for me, making sawdust in the backyard is meditative as it gets for me. So yes.
Fair enough.
Definitive yes to that question.
Tending to our orchids and getting rid of our dandelions.
That's right.
Nice. Another question about research. Is there any research regarding the value of rituals like funerals and vigils to those who have experienced loss?
Again, yeah. So a couple of years ago, Brandon Goodman and I, as a psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry, started a seminar for trainees on death and bereavement. And one of the bits of feedback we get after the first year was that we didn't have enough kind of cultural influences and diversity in the curriculum. And so we brought in kind of experts and reviewed a bunch of interesting studies that looked at how valuable it is to have structured, community-based, ritualized ways of dealing with all sorts of loss and adaptation. And so, I'm not a particularly religious Jew, but in my faith tradition, the notion of sitting Shiva, where it's a formal mourning period with kind of clearly delineated practices and prayers and involvement of family and community, I think makes a whole lot of sense and binds a lot of anxiety. It gives people a sense that there's something to do, that this has happened before me and it will continue after me. All of those things matter. I don't know how well it's been studied, but there's no question that those kinds of ritualized practices, kind of culturally determined, make a real difference in the healing process for a lot of people. Now, it's also true that for some people, again, depending on their antecedent context, that a strictly religious approach to certain kinds of mourning would miss terribly with them, and like it might feel like a empathic failure in various ways, so but as a general rule, I would say yes, that there's a reason that these practices are so well established in our societies and maintained over generations and generations.
Appreciate that. A question regarding whether there are any tips for dealing with mental health or neurodivergency stigma, especially with people of authority, e.g. potential employers or professors.
Yeah. I think that that's a really good question, and I would want to think about it more than I have, but that's not going to stop me from babbling on for a moment anyway. You know, when our son was very young, he was included in our son with autism. He was included in a number of inclusion programs in schools, and other community programs that that exposed a lot of people to not just the kinds of behaviors and difficulties our son had, but across the board, the most kind of neurodiverse populations imaginable. And I think that's really what changes society, is starting early, like having frequent exposures in all sectors of society, to increase tolerance and patience and understanding of kind of the wide range of skills and challenges that people have. So the number of times that I've been out with my son in public and someone has come up to me and said, "Hey, I used to volunteer at blank program," and then make some comment, far outnumber the times that people have given me and us trouble about some of the noise that my son makes or the behaviors that he makes. In a school setting, it's a balance. I mean, honestly, I think it's a case by case basis, and it depends on kind of striking the right balance between what serves the community best without kind of disrupting the entire enterprise, which sometimes happens. At one point, my son was nonverbal, and we just decided that he needed to be in a special school focused just on him, and the inclusion thing didn't work. It worked for a lot of other kids. So if whoever wrote that question wanted to send me an email, let me think about it a little bit more. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts about it, but I'm not sure what the right policy approaches are at a university. I know a lot of people smarter than me have thought about that in a lot of different universities, and kind of how to make the learning environment as open to as many people as possible, but without kind of too much disruption, if that's kind of what ends up happening in some cases. Hard question.
It is a hard question. And speaking of hard questions, the next questioner actually, I think, has 4 or 5 questions embedded into one. So what I may do is truncate this a little bit, but the person indicates that they'd like to hear an opinion from a provider on these issues because they've only been a prescribee. But they're curious to know, why is the prescription of psychiatric medication increasing so much? And why are more people than ever taking medication for a psychiatric condition?
Yeah. Is it more socially acceptable to take these medications? Yeah. That's a really complicated question, and there are a lot of different contributions to it. I do think that life is hard. I think life is harder in a lot of ways than it used to be. Some of the data out of the CDC that kind of have been documenting the frequency of depression and anxiety in adolescents are just truly alarming. And so I think that the incidence and prevalence of mental illness is going up in this country for a whole host of reasons. I think it's also true that we live in a world that, where there's a medical industrial complex. And there is a lot of influence of big pharma in a lot of drug prescribing practices. And, this is, again, an entirely different conversation, but, medicine has become, over the decades, a very large business. And, we spend a lot more money on prescription drugs than other countries do in various ways. And so I think that there are some financial incentives that kind of, creep in to this as well. And I also think that there's something about kind of our societal approach to, take a medicine and feel better that is pretty reductionistic and problematic in a lot of ways. I think that for many, many patients, psychiatric medications are life-saving and critical. And for a lot of people, they are helpful in all sorts of ways. But the data are very clear that the best outcomes for people with depression and anxiety and other mental health problems are a combination, with kind of really severe illness, combination of medication and talk therapy together. I do think it's more socially acceptable to take medications. I do think the threshold is low. It's all of those things.
Appreciate it. This next question, I'm guessing that your answer is going to be, it's complicated, but is how long does drama therapy take to feel better after gun violence?
Yeah.
Really discreet answer to that?
No, there's not. I think that it depends on what your outcome is. If it's to feel better, it can be quick. I think that there's a lot of data that people can get significant symptom reduction in the matter of a few sessions in several weeks or a couple of months. But it's not a one size fits all experience. And so gun violence, gun trauma, like anything else, kind of exists across a spectrum. If someone points a gun at you and shoots you, that's a different story than kind of if you heard gunshots and you were barricaded in a classroom, and that's different from kind of the social media barrage of information after something like this. And so there's kind of a dose response aspect of this that has to be taken into account. And I would also say that probably some of this doesn't ever go away entirely. And people that I've talked to have been victims of various types of violence will often tell me that they've given up on the notion that they're going to get over this entirely, but they've kind of compartmentalized it and kind of put it in a place where they can get on with their lives.
That reminds me of an issue that we've been addressing, I think, both among faculty and staff colleagues and certainly students, but is this question and concern about hypervigilance that we're hearing from folks in all channels, that they feel as though, particularly in the aftermath of this, that they are constantly assessing their environment for threats. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective and certainly your practice, the prevalence of that, whether this is a common occurrence, in particular, if there are any specific tools that you might recommend to help folks address that feeling?
You can't stay in a state of constant hyper alertness indefinitely. It'll burn out your adrenal glands. It's just, nobody can live like that indefinitely. There is a distinction between being aware and alert, knowing, where, being aware of your surroundings and being constantly hyper vigilant. And the goal is not to become numb to dangerous signals around you, but the goal is to be able to live a life feeling somewhat safe and secure where you are. I don't know what the incidence is of hypervigilance, these days, and I think it's going to depend on where you live and what your circumstances are. But it's I think that if you can't do anything else really if you're constantly worried about your safety. I mean, it interferes with just about anything. And so at some point, either you are in a genuinely, persistently dangerous place, in which case, if it's at all possible to not live in that place, that would be preferable, or it's not as dangerous as one may think it is, but you feel like that all the time, in which case that, that it can be a specific area of focus for both talk therapy and medication therapy.
Appreciate that. Another sort of career development kind of consideration question. An individual says, it's said that mental health professionals are wounded healers. Would you say it's okay for someone who has handled their mental health issue more or less adequately to pursue a career in psychiatry?
Sure. It all depends on the kind of more or less. I think that I think that having lived experience of depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, psychotic disorders can be enormously valuable in terms of identifying with, being compassionate, and kind of understanding the experience of your patients. I know lots and lots. Psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers, we're no different than anyone else. We have depression, anxiety, all sorts of kind of mental illness struggles like others do. I would caution that doing the work isn't treatment for whatever kind of difficulties the professional has, but I don't think it is kind of disqualifying in any way, unless there's a time when you're so actively struggling with whatever the struggle is that it makes it hard to be there for someone else. The job is to help other people. And if you're not in a place where you can do that, then either it's not a good field for you, or it's not a good time to be in that field. So everything is in that more or less effectively phrase. I think if it's more, absolutely, that should not be a disqualification. And I think that part of the training should be really understanding who you are and what your limits are, and so on. But it would be the height of hypocrisy to be in this field and say that, you can't be in this field if you've ever had a mental illness problem. I think that's nuts. Of course you can.
Appreciate that very much. I'll just remind folks that we're wrapping up here. So if you have any final questions for Dr. Rosenstein, please throw those into the Q&A. A final question that we often ask our facilitators, if folks are interested in doing more research, doing a little bit more homework, are there specific places that you might point people to right now to look for additional information about navigating trauma and grief? And maybe it's an and/or, might we steal from you a list of sort of recommended resources that we could post on our Heals Care Network channel after this conversation?
For sure. It's not just because I used to work for the federal government that I'm saying this, but I did used to work for the federal government, and I do believe that the National Institute of Mental Health has got a lot of great resources on their website related to trauma. There are professional societies related to PTSD and trauma and childhood trauma, some that are specific to specific kinds of trauma. So there's a lot out there. I would stay with kind of well-vetted resources, because, the internet, it's not always hard to get to the signal through the noise on the internet. So I would start with NIMH. There's the Society. I'm gonna mess up the name of this trauma society, but there are several, and I can follow up with you, Dr. Johnson, later. But and we'll put some up there. But there's one other thought I had and I lost it. Sorry.
No worries. We'll be here for another minute or so if it comes back. I appreciate this question, because this is something that I've heard a number of times from students about previous experience influencing reactions to this event. I've talked to students who said, I had this X kind of experience and I thought I was fine with it, and this has brought it all back, and I feel like I'm reliving that and this all over again. I think you touched on this certainly in talking about your previous experience and your history, but do you have any particular advice for an individual who thought, I thought I'd resolved this and now it's all back, and how do I handle that?
Absolutely. So a couple of thoughts about this. Number one, I love that expression that history doesn't so much repeat itself, but rhymes. And I think personal history can rhyme as well. And so there can be generalization from prior difficult experiences. And what I would say is that that is as good a ticket in the door to an exploratory psychotherapy as I can think of, because for example, I work in the cancer hospital, and I previously mentioned the terribly high frequency of prior sexual abuse that so many women in this country experience. I can't tell you how many patients I've seen over the years who have been secondarily traumatized coming into medicine with a breast cancer, a gynecologic cancer, and what they'll say to us is that they thought this was gone and resolved and buried. It can be years earlier, sometimes decades earlier, and it can bubble up after a long period of quiescence. And I think that understanding what those associations are, what those triggers are, what those circumstances are that get you back into a different part of time in your life can be enormously helpful. And I think that that's one of the best things that can happen as a result of psychotherapy, is kind of connecting some dots that previously were not connected in your life. So, you know, you don't have to do that with therapy. People do that with their own exploration. They can do that in a faith community. But I think that most therapists who are at the least trauma-informed therapists, if not experts in trauma therapy, that's kind of right in their wheelhouse, and can be very helpful. It's not surprising. It's a very common experience to be like, you know, wow, I kind of haven't felt like that in a long time. That's too familiar.
Yeah, very helpful. Well, I appreciate that so much. We have a final kind of comment followed by a question in the Q&A. An individual indicates a real appreciation for you discussing the long-term impact of adverse childhood events. And in particular, then the concluding question is, how can students become aware of the existence of any help on campus and access that help? And I would say here again, Dr. Rosenstein, I appreciated so much you mentioning CAPS on campus, which of course is our clinical resource for students. If they are interested in pursuing counseling, students can get in immediately for an initial assessment and obviously pursue both individual and group options if they are interested in doing so. In addition to that, though, we have a whole host of resources, as I think we've talked about many times here in the conversation. And where I would first direct any member of our community, faculty, staff, or students, is to consider going to the Heals Care Network website, which is care.unc.edu. We have a mental health resource hub button right there that brings together a comprehensive list of the resources that we know are available on campus for all manner of things, clinical resources and beyond, that you can sort of filter based on your identity or your interest, a particular venue, whether you're interested in online or some sort of hybrid option or an in-person option. That's a great resource. We have peer support right there. There's a chat function for students to be able to link directly to a peer advisor. You can make a care referral about somebody in the community. There are suicide resources, a whole host of information. So please, please use that as your go-to resource, not only for yourself, but remember there's a role for all of us to play here in the community. And I hope that whether it's a student or a faculty or staff member, you know that you can not only pursue resources for yourself, but know about those so that you can help a colleague or a student and get them connected as well. That's an important thing that all of us can do to support one another and to immediately get connected with those resources. You can also feel free to reach out to our student affairs team for those same kinds of things. So know that that's an option as well. Well, it is 1:28. I am mindful of keeping us on schedule. If I could please ask our production team to put up the CLE credit slide so that we can have that for any of you who are students who joined us in order to get CLE credit. And again, thanks for being here. I want to particularly thank Dr. Donald Rosenstein for helping us so much with this conversation today, doing so relatively quickly, and just your graciousness and approach. We are very appreciative appreciative of you and all of the dialogue today. Thank you. Thank you. Also would like to thank my colleagues, Sarah Stallman and Jesus Enriquez, who are behind the scenes, making all of this go and look easy. We know it is not. Please also use the Hills Care Network. This is the first in our mental health seminar series for the year. More will be posted there as we move through the year. So please check that out. And aside from that, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation today. Thank you for being a part of our Carolina community, and take good care of yourselves and each other. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.